A quote often attributed to the late Stan Lee is that comic books operate at their best with the illusion of change, giving it a seemingly endless lifespan. The idea that a character, like Spider-Man, for example, can be publicized year after year and still be near identical to their original iteration is admittedly kind of impressive, but overall starts to feel a bit empty after a while. It doesn't have to be that way. A comic can be told, and told well, with the intent of keeping itself going as long as it needs to, focusing on its own emotional weight and storytelling ability, without succumbing to tropes, reboots, or overdone cliches. Marvel and DC are, of course, the big dogs in the comic industry, but oftentimes, the best graphic novels to be found are with a third party, like Image Comics. In 2003, they gave us something special. A tale that ran for 144 issues, each one better than the last, that had a satisfying beginning, middle, and end. The story in question was called After writing the satirical Battle Pope, Kentucky-born comic fan Robert Kirkman was led into the Image Comics creative team to work on the Super Patriot miniseries. Along with a few other projects like Science Dog and Tech Jacket, Kirkman began to work on the graphic novel we now call He and his roommate at the time, Cory Walker, started brainstorming their own original story satirizing the modern graphic novel industry. The plan was essentially this. If Superman had a child, how would they come into their own in a world already packed with superhuman heroes? But there was a twist. The comic would focus on two major facets: real consequences for the hero's actions, and a major focus on their relationships with other people, not the world he operated in. Next, of course, was coming up with a name for their protagonist. A few monikers were bounced around, most notably being Bulletproof and Kid Cosmic. Eventually, with a push for something better by Cory Walker, they landed on The behind-the-scenes details beyond the comic's inception are pretty scarce, aside from some public talks from Kirkman about the ending of the series, which, of course, we're not going to touch on, especially this early into the video. Instead, let's talk about the comic itself. The series ran from 2003 all the way to 2018, 15 whole years of building a universe of diverse characters and action. Plus, there were a number of connected comics: Tech Jacket, Brit, Invincible Universe, The Astounding Wolfman, and more. It took off running and didn't stop until it knew it had to. While I don't want to get into spoilers, especially with the resurgence of fans from the new Amazon show, suffice it to say that the series and its spin-offs had a satisfying beginning, middle, and end a majority of the time. It's difficult to say more about it, if I'm being honest. How many ways can you say something is great? The characters are rounded, the story focuses on difficult situations in all sorts of ways, you see heroes struggle with moral codes, and in some cases even break them. The issue with mainstream comics is a fear of having their protagonist cross a line, which is usually set by their own moral compass. Invincible still does that, but isn't afraid to have someone actually cross through that barrier. Characters like Batman make the excuse that they'll never kill because they basically wouldn't be able to stop. Characters in Invincible make the argument of whether or not lethal force is or was necessary, and if that line is going to become easier to cross in the future. And you can actually see that play out in a few different ways. The world itself is also set apart from its peers, giving us a planet that has adjusted entirely to random superpowers cropping up. Introducing things like tutors specifically trained to help superpowered children who can't go to public school, or damage to a city being fixed relatively quickly from heroes banding together. Things like housing crises and social class are talked about in the forefront too, instead of being hand-waved away because it's a difficult thing to talk about. The world of Invincible is vibrant and alive, and most importantly, dynamic from issue 1 to 144. One of the things Kirkman had said in an AMA about Invincible was this. That was kind of the idea. to do a massive superhero universe of stories focused on one character for the most part, and contained in one book. I love Marvel and DC, and wanted to try and do something different while paying tribute to all the stuff I loved. I appreciate the sentiment, and much of what he says here can be seen on the page itself, except there's a bit of an issue from it. Invincible started out as a standalone narrative, but it sure didn't stay that way for long. I mentioned earlier the handful of spin-off stories that have spread out the comics universe. While admittedly none of them are absolutely necessary to enjoy Invincible on its own, a majority of them fill in some pretty notable gaps in the narrative. Normally, this wouldn't be such a bad thing. Plenty of comics do this in the industry, either for creative or business reasons. The actual problem comes from the fact that most of the spin-off material just isn't quite as good. Now, I decided a while ago that I want these video essays to be always about something I really love. I don't want to be one of those people that just points at an awful product and tells you that it's bad and deserves ridicule. So I'm going to go over the good parts of Invincible and its spin-offs and just quietly sidestep the parts that I feel aren't worth your time. Taking place earliest in the Invincible timeline, this 3-issue limited series gives some much-needed insight into the early days for Eve and Rex. The relationship never really gets fully explained in the mainline comics, only ever hinted at. Invincible presents Adam, Eve, and Rexplode, explains the key details of how they met, where Rex got his powers, and how they came into their own superhero personas before Mark began his story as Invincible. It's pretty obvious that the main narrative would be part of the upper crust. I won't touch on it too long since I feel it's been covered well enough earlier, but really, if you even have a vague interest in Invincible, just read the series from beginning to end. Then try out the other stuff I'll be talking about here if it piques your interest. Serving as a solid standalone one-off story, Brit is enjoyable from start to finish. Although it's a fairly simple narrative with a protagonist I'd describe as being 90% action figure and 10% genuine heart, it's still definitely worth a read. Plus, it really adds to the overall experience of reading Invincible itself. Although not perfect in my mind, being bogged down with pacing issues and a lack of focus, The Astounding Wolfman is more often a fun read than it isn't, and as I mentioned once before, is one of those comics that fills in the gaps left by Invincible. Overall, I'd recommend it if you're a fan of things like werewolves or a super fan of Invincible, but if I'm being honest, it just barely squeaked its way onto this list for me. Falling into the reading order of Invincible just after issue 102, Invincible Universe serves to expand the narrative of the superheroes that you otherwise only get glimpses of. But there's a real crux with this one. In my mind, only 5 of the series' 12 issues actually makes the cut for this list. Issues 1, 2, and 3 are good, as are 8 and 9, but the rest of it is honestly the most cliched writing I've seen in the whole narrative world of Invincible. I said it before, I don't want to be negative, so to explain myself, I'll just say that having a story where it's all a dream has really been done to death. And writer Phil Hester definitely didn't do his homework when he decided where 2 of the main heroes would get married. But anyways, all in all, Invincible is fantastic. I know I harped on the negative aspects a bit harder than I probably should have, but you have to keep in mind that nearly all of the graphic novel and its spin-offs are really quite amazing. It's just upsetting seeing an otherwise perfect story get tripped up by such little mistakes. If I was asked point blank if you should read Invincible, the answer is easy. Yes. God, yes. Do it now. And hey, let me know your thoughts on it in the comments, or about the Amazon show, since that's been a major success too. I mean, that's why I came around to the comics myself. In any case, if you enjoyed the video, hit the subscribe button, and I'll catch you in the next one.